Welcome to Always Be Looking with me, Alan Stein, and my two fabulous guests. Today we have Kara Gabay. I knew Kara during my tenure at Google, and we've had lots of fun war stories of our time there, and Kara's still there. I did not survive. And we have Taylor Snipes, who is a former Amazon bar raiser and now is leading recruiting at DoorDash. So seasoned professionals, hiring managers that have hired people, recruiters that have assessed talent upfront. And on today's talk of Always Be Looking, we're talking about pivots, what to consider, how to do it, and we'll talk about different pivots that we've done here and also advice for you. And most importantly, or most fun, we like to take lots of questions. So do put your questions in the comments and chat, and we will answer those at the end of our slides. We'll go through a few slides. We have a giveaway, and then we will take your Q&A. Let's get started here with the slides. First off, we're going to talk about the most important tool when making a pivot. And based on my experience, based on my background, I am now on my 7th career. And when I moved from psychology to Wall Street, it was networking and building relationships that got me in that door. When I went from venture capital to baseball, that was a big pivot that I did that only was able to occur because of me going down to the baseball winter meetings in Nashville, Tennessee, and the minor league baseball meetings in Atlanta, and building relationships and really networking. Because otherwise, why would a baseball team hire someone that had a venture capital and finance background? So the most important tool when making a pivot, I always found, was networking. Kara, I'd love your perspective in terms of, has networking ever helped you to pivot in your career?
Yeah, I think the last 5 roles that I've gotten have been because of my network. Even those were moves internally at Google. But even when you're moving internally, it's really good to have a strong network internally. And I'd say my network is also very helpful in helping me secure coaching clients outside of work. I think I'm blessed to have a very strong, amazing network. Might have a little bit to do with my age. But like one tip for building your network, if your network's not already that great, I always advise clients at the end of an informational interview with someone in your network, ask them, who else do you think I should talk to? And that can help you just build out your network if it's not already strong.
Those are great tips. And the point of the age and the experience, I think that's something that people underestimate. People often say that they are maybe discriminated against or there's biases in the system because of ageism. And sometimes there is, but there's lots of benefits also. Your vast amount of experience and that network and those relationships that you've built up make it easier every time you need to do your next pivot. Taylor, love your perspective on this in terms of networking and how that's either empowered you or clients in the past.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thinking back to my very first job, I remember at a career fair in school, and there was a friend I had, just made friends with through college. And then she was actually working the career fair at the booth. That ended up being my first job out of school at a big recruiting agency. And just through building friendships, networking from an early age, that got me my first role. I'm now actually in my 5th role internally at DoorDash, got the DoorDash role through my network. And by being able to move around within the company, all started with me reaching out, just asking to get some time with employees, getting to know what they were doing, ended up finding out that this is interesting and pursued those conversations, built the network, and then that kind of gets your foot in the door and helped me land that internal mobility.
So critical. Thanks for sharing that. Next up, Taylor here, and this is an old photo of you, unless you just didn't shave this morning, but pivoting from recruiting to sales, why you made the switch and the challenges that came with it. Love to hear a little bit about this and how you managed through it.
Spent 2.5 years in a recruiting firm, really enjoyed it, but I think got to a point where I just had that internal reflection, hey, look, is this something that I want to do as a career, or is there something else that's a little bit more exciting? And I think just asking yourselves those questions, having those consistent check-ins is vital to any role in career. And I think for me, I kind of always have been an athlete growing up, competitive nature of sales and having that kind of scoreboard type role was really exciting to me. And it was also that internal reflection and just checking in is what made me lead to make the switch. We'll definitely jump into the challenges a little bit more. I think that the challenge for me was like, look, I don't have that traditional sales experience. I'll pause there because we'll definitely jump in on like how I overcame that. But yeah, I think that's a common theme. Don't let that be a blocker, right? If you're looking to make a pivot, just because you don't have those experiences, there's definitely ways you can overcome those. And we'll jump into that probably a little bit later here.
Why don't you share now? Like, how did you overcome those? Like, what were the challenges and how did you go about overcoming them?
While the job description, I didn't have exactly what it was saying, but there's a way you can tell a story. Like recruiting, for example, when you're selling a job to a client, you're selling that job, right? There is sales in every single role. So I think also going out and finding new business, right? Like new clients to find that needed staffing needs, whether it be temporary projects or new folks, you're selling yourself in those calls. And I did have success in the recruiting. So I think that's where I was able to translate that into the experience. Like you call it out, look, I don't have that traditional experience, but here's where I was excelling in the sale. And I think just connecting the dots, talking, going back to the networking place, like people all over the place have made these pivots. So it's asking those questions, learning how did they overcome where they may have lacked that experience.
And Kara, there's a question here about how you're able to convince recruiters when you apply for a role that you don't necessarily have experience in, either in, you're a hiring manager.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've hired some people before that didn't necessarily have the exact experience you were looking for.
Yeah.
How did they get on your radar and how did you consider them?
3 things jumped out at me at the same time. One, at Google, I hired a woman who I was hiring for a strategy and operations position. And this woman worked at Amazon doing logistics in the warehouse. But when I asked a question, even though I was talking about sales operations, she was able to share examples from what she did in a warehouse, doing something completely different that I saw that she had the skills that could translate to what I needed. And we hired her. So that's one. 2, I have a client now who is able to tie their skills from being a pastry chef to work in strategy and operations. And then finally, I paid my way through school as a waitress. I will hire a waitress or a waiter any day for strategy and operations because of just like the process and precision that they need to keep things going in a restaurant. So those are the 3 stories that came to mind for me.
And that person at Amazon that convinced you that they can do sales ops, how did they get on your radar? Was it a referral or was it because, hey, they're at Amazon, they must be smart?
That came through the recruiter. I did get this through a Google recruiter.
Okay. So it was probably Amazon, the brand there.
Probably, yeah.
Probably made it to your desk. Some other situations, like Taylor, I don't know if like answering that question about how you're able to convince recruiters. Is it really convincing recruiters or is it more effective to get on the radar of a hiring manager?
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be both ways, right? You'll have some amazing candidates that have multiple offers and are working with multiple recruiters. So I think that's where you really want to do a great job at selling your case. Why is this the role? Why? And that all comes from doing your research. But then again, hiring manager as well. It's a 2-way street. You need to work both avenues.
Cool. Let's go on to the next slide. So, Kara, going lateral or gasp, even taking a demotion to gain new skills, experience, and network. Love to hear you expound on this a little bit.
Sure. Especially in big tech, I think everyone's familiar with the levels. Right? You come in at a certain level and then your first goal is how do I get to the next level? It's like a video game, just wanting to get to the next level. And so many folks I know, friends, colleagues, clients are very focused on what do I need to do to get to the next level. That's not easy these days. It used to be easier. It's not easy right now. And so what I encourage folks to think about is, one, what's important to you right now in your life at this moment in time? What's important to you right now? Examples could be, it's important to me that I work on a global team, or that's a skill I'm trying to build. I want global experience on my resume. If we stick with that example, there may be other roles at the same level that offer you global experience that you're not getting now. Or maybe you want exposure to senior level execs, and there's an opportunity to do that at the same level. And so I encourage people to think about what's important to you now, and then where do you want to go so you can understand what are the skills that I need to get to that next place where I ultimately want to go. And maybe it's the same level. Now, what I'll share here is the gasp part is more of my own personal story. And again, we talked about my age, so maybe I'm in a different stage of my career. But when I did this exercise myself a couple of years ago of where do I want to be and what's important to me now, I realized that though I loved managing my team at Google and I was a manager for years, the part that was really important to me was coaching and mentoring my team and not some of the administrative burden that comes with managing a team in big tech, right? And so in that moment, I actually took a level cut, which was crazy, right? You're like on this hamster wheel of trying to get promoted all the time. And I just said, you know what? I think I'm going to go the other way. And I went from being a manager to being an individual contributor so I could focus on building out a coaching practice, even outside of Google. And so that's what was important to me. But I see it as a promotion in my life because I'm getting towards the place where I want to be.
That's a really interesting perspective. And the title or the level is just one aspect of the whole job. There's like happiness, there's learning, there's growth, there's work-life balance, there's compensation, there's all different sort of things. So just because a level changes down or up, it doesn't mean that everything else is necessarily all good or all bad. Taylor, anything from your past or what you've seen from individuals before in terms of how to think about levels and lateral move versus only thinking going up?
Yeah, one of the best managers I've ever worked for. We actually started in a similar position at DoorDash. She ended up getting promoted, was staying on the individual contributor route, but had that moment, I think similar to you, Kara, where she just had that reflection and realized, look, I really want to get into leadership and begin leading a team. And the current role that we were in at that time, there had been a lot of seasoned leaders. There really wasn't any opportunity opening up anytime soon. And she ended up taking a step back, per se, to join this new team that was being spun up. And it was a big risk, right? We didn't know if this team would have longevity or be around much longer. And she ended up taking a step back with the sole reason, having a conversation with the leader of that newly spun up team. Hey, this is where I want to go. She was very clear about her vision and what was important to her. And I'm willing to come back, take this pay cut, and actually move across the country. Moved, I think, from the Northeast to Texas and was able to pretty much make it happen and ended up managing the team that she ended up being my manager. It's just, I think it speaks power to like just having that internal reflection and taking that risk. And again, even though it per se is a demotion, it was a pay cut. It ended up being a promotion for her goals and her happiness. And now the rest is history. She's been doing phenomenal since.
Kara, looks like you might have wanted to add something there.
No, I love that story. It just goes back to knowing what's important to you now and where you want to go. And maybe there's this piece of confidence in it too, right? To be confident that it's okay to take lateral, possibly in this Taylor story, a step back to propel, to go forward.
Yeah. And I always remember when I went to Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg used to always say it's not a career ladder, it's a jungle gym. And I think that's a good way to think about it. Like sometimes you go up, down, sideways as you are expanding and growing your career and challenging yourself in all different directions. And I think if you are making that conscious choice, it's a very different situation. Like Kara, you were taking a step back so that you can focus your time on developing your coaching practice. Sometimes when it's forced upon you, it's a different perspective. Taylor, how to stand out when you lack certain experience, and you're one of the least experienced person that I know. So tell us how you stand out. Okay.
Yeah, I think honesty, calling out the elephant in the room, and then also figuring out ways how to connect what I said earlier, finding those areas where you can connect the dots where you're lacking that experience. There's definitely a story to tell. I also think just storytelling is such a powerful tool. When I remember looking back to the interview when I interviewed for that sales role without the experience, I did a little research, found out that the person I was speaking to played football in college, and me being an athlete growing up, I told a story that had nothing to do with my work experience. It just happened to do with how growing up playing baseball, my dad was one of those tough baseball dads that always had you first one to practice an hour early. And I'd always be frustrated, like, why are we getting here so early? And then we'd always be the last one to leave. And I just had a feeling like, look, knowing that this interviewer had that football experience, I was hoping they would relate to that. And I remember thinking, like, seeing that the interviewer smile when I was telling that story. And he's like, yeah, your dad was just like mine. And I think that came down to storytelling, right? Like a lot of times you're interviewing And it's a lot of it's just a culture fit. And if this person, am I going to enjoy working with this person? It's not only about experience. So I think if you can really hammer the storytelling and tell a good story, be memorable, it can really help you stand out when you lack that experience.
Yeah. And I think with that story there as well, like building that rapport with somebody around like sports, like I always recommend that people put interests at the bottom of their resume. As the interviewer will often, like, if there's something interesting there, the whole interview could start off with that. Like I got hired once because I said I was a team statistician of the Binghamton Rangers, and I was interviewing for a job as an equity analyst, and my boss was just a huge hockey fan. And the whole interview was about hockey. If you have that alignment with someone, if you have that commonality, like the uncommon commonality, you build that rapport. And to Kara's point previously, like then you can get through the noise, and the hiring manager can start to see that it's not rocket science, and you can probably learn some of the things that you don't have experience in. Kara, I'd love your perspective if you've seen like candidates that have stood out lacking experience, or if you've done it, like your story of going from a waitress to Google.
Yeah, I love the idea of storytelling. I think that ties in when you have experience like working at a restaurant, and how you can tie that in. Storytelling is really key. I think this is another place where what we started with, your network, can really help, because if someone vouches for you, for your work ethic, for your ability to gain new skills, and you just have somebody that's a booster helping you, that would be fantastic. But one thing I want to call out here, if there's a place you want to go and you lack certain experience, what are some ways that you can get that experience before getting the job? And for instance, could you volunteer? Could you offer to take on a project? Could you shadow somebody? What are the things that you can consider to help gain some of that experience before you get to an interview?
Yeah, that's critical. And when people will volunteer, do a free internship or something, or even offer to do a project, that can really make you stand out, especially at smaller organizations. It's harder sometimes at a Google to do that. Mm-hmm. There are ways that you can stand out from the crowd.
I shared this story with you of college, and still doing with my life. And the advertising, because I love the show 30 something, and Michael and Elliot are doing advertising. Maybe I should too. I called Hudson Valley Magazine and just asked if I could work there for free, like an internship, even though I wasn't in college. And I did that during the day, and then I left at 4 to get to my waitressing job. But then all of a sudden, I had advertising experience at a magazine to put on my resume.
That's how I got my job in baseball. I interned for free at the Brooklyn Cyclones. And then I got hired as a director of promotions for the New Haven Raven. Anyway, I think that hustle and creativity does help you to stand out. So we are actually done here. We're having another Always Be Looking. Kara and I are doing on the 20th. Taylor, because he didn't have enough experience, is not getting invited back for that one. This is just a deep dive on coaching and mentorship sponsorship with Kara and myself on the 20th. And then also, we actually have a brand new resume template that we're giving away for free. If you want to grab that, you can scan the QR code. And with that, I am going to go to the questions. The first question is for both of you. So I'll start with Kara. What's your number one takeaway from today that you want to share with people to set themselves up for success?
My number one takeaway is probably going back to that network. Who's in your network? How can you expand your network? I think that's probably one of the most critical things for making any pivot.
Yeah, to double tap on the networking, I think just always be curious. Any conversation you're having with anyone, I think it goes such a long way when you're actively listening, when you're curious and show general interest, especially when it comes to networking and like the workforce. People remember that, people respect that, and it'll take you very far.
Next two questions are about internal mobility. So as we're talking about always be looking and pivoting, there's lots of ways to do it internally within a company, especially at a larger company. So Kara, if you want to transfer internally, how transparent should you be with your current team and manager about that?
And you know what my answer is going to be. This really depends. It depends on the relationship you have with your current manager. It depends on the psych safety that you're feeling. So this is one where I would maybe encourage you to work with a coach. But this is something that you'll need to answer on how safe you feel sharing that information. In so many cases, your manager will be helpful and supportive and just really help you make that dream happen. In other cases, and I've experienced both in my life, in other cases, I knew probably best to keep quiet and do my looking quietly.
Yeah, this one's very subtle. Like ideally, you have your manager's support. That makes it easiest. But if you don't, yeah, then maybe seek a coach or seek mentorship or support there because that's a little bit tougher and they may block you. Next one, I'll pass to Taylor for internal mobility. How should you target people individually? Like, how should you target people internally to start building those relationships? That, like, if you want to pivot from sales to recruiting, for instance, how would you do that internally?
Yeah, I think the best way out, or at least what was successful for me, is I would try to throw some time on with someone that would likely be like a lateral move. And just, it's a very casual introduction. Hey, look, would love to introduce myself. See if you could find some sort of commonality, whether it be through like looking at their LinkedIn or even asking maybe a mutual friend in the company that knows the person. And then just say, hey, keep it very like open-minded. Just want to chat. I had a few questions about the role that you're in, and it's something that's always interested me. Or you could use that commonality, say something about that to break the ice, and yeah, keep it casual. I think people, especially within the company, are very willing to chat and meet folks internally.
Yeah, good tips. I think also internally leverage the org charts. The org charts are often public, like internally public. So look at those org charts, see who you know around the org, and try to build or leverage those relationships. ERGs are also good, employee resource groups, to expand your network. Next question's for Kara. How do you know it's time to leave a job, a team, or a company? And I know you've been at Google for a while, but you've worked on different teams within there. And yeah, how have you learned when's the right time? And maybe you can talk more about the job or the team than the company.
Yeah, true. I did work at an ad agency prior to Google, but I've spent a majority of my career at Google. But I have changed jobs probably every 2.5 to 3 years. And what happens for me is I get bored. Or think about it. A leader I worked with once said, when you take a new job, you should spend the first year or so learning. The second year is, okay, I got this down. And then the third year, it's probably time to start thinking about what's next, right? And so I could get bored when things start to go on autopilot for me. That's when I'm like, okay, probably ready to solve new problems, work with new people. And fortunately, I've been able to do that all under the Google umbrella. In other cases, again, this goes to what's important to me now. Where do I want to go? What are those skills that I want to develop? At one point, I wanted to get global experience. I went over, worked on a global team, realized that was not for me, and went back to a regional role. But yeah, I think every 2-3 years, or to the name of this program, always be looking. Why not always be looking, even if you're happy in your role? Because you never know what else is out there.
Yeah, totally agree. And the fact that you say that 2 to 3 years, this slide up here, I was presented with the inverse of this slide as a people manager at American Express, where they taught us to keep people engaged on the team as long as possible, because after a year or two, that individual provides a lot more value for the company. But then I thought in my head, I was like, fuck that. I want to be getting value for me as an employee. So after that, like 1 or 2, I think it's really 2 years. Every 2 years, you should be looking for something new, either up, getting promoted, or over in terms of lateral. And if you're not getting that, then maybe get the hell out. Cool. And Taylor, we have a question for you here. This is kind of a broad one, but what tips do you have for people of how to position yourself when networking, when trying to make a pivot? I know it's probably very specific to individuals, but any tips or tricks on how best to position yourself if you're trying to pivot into some other function or industry?
Yeah, I think ask a lot of questions, be curious. Ask that exact question to someone who's made a bunch of pivots and has jumped around. And I think just putting yourself out there and not being timid or afraid of, if you look, people are busy, they might not respond, and that's okay, but you just be curious and keep asking questions. It's the best way to learn and be a sponge.
Kara, anything else you would add to that?
No, Taylor, that sounds great.
So we are out of questions and we're a couple of minutes over time. So I want to be respectful of Taylor, your time, Kara, your time, and the audience's time. Before we leave, a couple of things. One, please come back and see us on March 20th. Secondly, do grab our resume. Third, Taylor and Kara, do you have one last piece of sick career advice that you would like to share with the 66 people here? Kara, you go first.
Yeah, what's been top of mind for me through this whole conversation? I sit in big tech. We've been going through layoffs for the past year. And then at the same time, I see the news on the job reports, right? And the jobs are great. And I'm like, what? That doesn't compute. And so I'm encouraging everyone to look at what industries are growing. And that's a great pivot. So hospitality is hot right now. And what can you take from your skills in one industry and bring over to hospitality, just as an example? So yeah, just want to share that.
That's great. And any last words of wisdom?
I'd say choose optimism. I think it's easy right now to get discouraged. It's a tough market, and especially considering 2023 with all the layoffs pretty much across the board in every industry. There's a lot of great people out there out of work and a lot of folks that are maybe getting rejections, but just choose optimism, keep going. I think that's the best strategy I'd give you.
Cool. I agree with that. The one thing I'll add is always remember that we are all employed at will. And that's why the title of this is Always Be Looking. Like, while I think you should always be optimistic and always think about what you can be going towards, just don't let your career be dictated by the corporate overlords that are paying us a paycheck. And instead, the last three words I'll leave you with are own your career.